Rain had been falling over Ashford Park since 4 in the morning, the kind of steady, purposeful rain that found every gap in a window frame and turned the lower corridor outside the still room into a map of small puddles by 6:30. The lamps had been lit early, the kitchen fires had been coaxed from damp wood, and somewhere between the third creditor's letter and the morning's first inventory of the buttery, Eleanor Voss had stopped noticing the rain entirely. She was seated at the housekeeper's table in the room behind the kitchen, a table that had been cleared of everything except a ruled ledger, 2 letters bearing the seals of men who expected to be answered, and a cup of tea that had gone cold without her touching it. She was 28 years old. She had been managing Ashford Park for 4 years and 2 months. She did not have a title for what she actually did, because the title would have required someone to admit how much of it she was doing. The steward, Mr. Aldrich Fenn, had died in January of a chest complaint that had been worsening since autumn. The Duke was in London and had been in London, according to the household's fragmented memory, for 14 months. The estate's accounts were entangled with 3 creditors and a disputed wool merchant's contract. The upper staff had spent the first 3 weeks after Mr. Fenn's death in a careful arrangement of looking toward each other and not toward the problem, until Eleanor had sat down at this table, opened the ledger, and begun. And at the edge of all that rain and silence, her pen moving without hurry across a page of figures, was Eleanor Voss. She was not employed as the housekeeper, precisely. She had come to Ashford Park as the companion to the Duke's elderly aunt, who had died the previous spring and left Eleanor without a formal position or any particular plan. The butler, Mr. Aldous Crewe, had suggested she stay through the month. The month had become 2, then 4, then a year, and somewhere in the interval, the household had simply organized itself around her, without quite acknowledging it had done so. She had no salary for the steward's work. She had her room, her board, and the £12 annually she had been receiving since the beginning, as a companion's fee, that no one had thought to stop paying. She kept her own accounts. She knew exactly what the arrangement cost her, and what it gave her in return, and she had made the calculation with clear eyes, and kept making it, month after month, because the alternative was to watch a household of 19 people run quietly to pieces. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She dipped her pen and returned to the column of figures. The creditor letter on the right was from a Mr. Houghton of Bristol, who was owed £470 for timber supplies, delivered the previous autumn, and who had now written 3 times in ascending irritation. The creditor letter on the left was from the wool merchants Baxter and Crane, who were disputing a delivery weight from July, and claiming the estate owed them an additional £60 on the basis of a contract clause Eleanor had read twice and believed they were misapplying. She set Mr. Houghton's letter aside. She had already drafted his response. She turned her full attention to Baxter and Crane. The clause in question, Clause 7 of the supply agreement, dated the 3rd of March 1813, specified that delivery weights were to be verified at the merchant's warehouse prior to transport, with discrepancies of more than 5% to be resolved by joint inspection. The merchants were claiming the estate had waived joint inspection by accepting delivery without written protest within 14 days. Eleanor had gone back through Mr. Fenn's papers and found a letter written on the 21st day after delivery, which was technically outside the 14-day window, but the letter itself referenced a prior conversation with Mr. Fenn's assistant, in which the estate had raised the discrepancy verbally. If a verbal notice had been given within the window, the written confirmation of it came within any reasonable interpretation of the clause's intent. She wrote carefully. She did not argue. She cited Clause 7, line by line. She noted the date of the letter and the date of the referenced conversation. She requested that Baxter and Crane produce their own record of the verbal exchange. She kept the tone of someone consulting a document together rather than contesting it. It was not charm. It was architecture. She sealed both letters, set them with the morning's post, and opened the household ledger to the week's accounts. The kitchen stores needed replenishment by Thursday. The upper servants' quarterly wages were due in 9 days. One of the tenant farmers, a Mr. Birch of the Northfield, had sent word that the drainage channel behind his grain store had collapsed and needed repair before the autumn planting could be assessed. Eleanor added Mr. Birch's request to a column she had been keeping since February, a column she thought of privately as the arrears of attention, things that had not been tended because no one had been in a position to authorize the expenditure. The column had 17 entries. She had resolved 4 of them on her own authority, using money she had recovered by renegotiating the kitchen's flour contract and consolidating 2 laundry suppliers into one. The other 13 required either the Duke's written instruction or his presence. She had written to him twice since January. Both letters had been acknowledged by a solicitor's office in London with the same brief reply. The Duke's affairs were under review and a response would be forthcoming. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She closed the ledger and went to find Mr. Crewe. He was in the front hall, standing at the window that faced the drive, watching the rain. "The Duke's carriage," he said, without turning, "was seen on the Warwick Road this morning. He's expected by midday." Eleanor stood very still for a moment. Not from surprise exactly, but from the particular stillness of a person recalculating every piece of the day at once. "I see," she said. "Then we have approximately 4 hours." She went back to her table, pulled out a clean sheet of paper, and began making a list. She was still making it when the carriage turned into the drive. The Duke of Ashford was 34 years old, and he arrived at his estate the way a man arrives at a place he is not certain he should have left. He stepped down from the carriage in the rain without waiting for the footman's umbrella, looked at the house for a moment as though measuring it against something, and walked up the front steps with the particular bearing of someone who has decided to be present now and will deal with whatever that costs later. He was tall and precisely dressed in a dark coat that showed the journey's weather without apologizing for it. He wore authority the way he wore the coat, as something fitted to the purpose, not for display. His face gave nothing away. The footman who materialized on the steps and the housekeeper who appeared in the entrance hall to receive him would not have been able to say afterward whether he was glad to be home or dreading it. His expression suggested only that he had arrived. Mr. Crewe met him in the entrance hall, offered a correct welcome, and began the inventory of waiting matters. The Duke listened, gave one-word acknowledgments, handed over his hat and gloves, and said he would see the estate's accounts after he had changed. "Yes, Your Grace," Mr. Crewe said. Then, because Mr. Crewe was a man who believed in accurate reporting, "Miss Voss will have them ready." The Duke paused, one hand resting on the banister. "Miss Voss," he said. The name was a question. "The late Lady Mercer's companion, Your Grace. She has been, that is to say, in Mr. Fenn's absence, she has been managing the household accounts, among other matters." There was a silence that lasted approximately 3 seconds. The Duke's eyes moved once, a brief and measuring sweep of the entrance hall, the lamps lit correctly, the floors dry despite the rain outside, the hall table cleared and ordered, and then he continued up the stairs. He did not say anything more, but he had looked at the hall the way a man looks at something he did not expect to find in working order. Eleanor was in the estate office when he came down an hour later, changed and composed. She had arranged the ledgers on the desk in the order she would have presented them to Mr. Fenn, the household accounts first, then the estate revenues, then the creditor correspondence, then the arrears column. She stood when he entered, as was correct. He looked at the desk. "Mr. Crewe tells me you've been managing this since January," he said. "Since Mr. Fenn died, Your Grace." "Yes." "On what authority?" "On none," she said. "There was no one else to do it." He sat down at the desk and opened the first ledger. He read in silence for several minutes. Eleanor remained standing, which was not entirely comfortable, but she had spent 4 years being invisible in rooms, and she had learned that the way to be taken seriously in a room was to stay in it. He turned a page, then another. He paused at the column she thought of as the arrears of attention. "These 17 items," he said. "What is the order of priority?" "Mr. Birch's drainage channel is urgent. It will affect the autumn assessment of the north field. After that, the upper roof section above the east wing. There's been water ingress for 2 seasons, and the plasterwork is beginning to show it. The others can be sequenced across the next quarter without loss." "What would the drainage repair cost?" £12, if the work is done by the estate's own labourers under Mr. Tanner's direction. 22, if we engage outside contractors. And the roof? 48, estimated, for proper repair. There is a temporary measure that would hold through winter for 8. I would recommend the temporary measure now, and full repair in the spring, once we have the year-end accounts settled. He looked at her then, not the way a man looks at a servant who has surprised him, the way a man looks at a document that contains more information than the document was supposed to contain. "Sit down, Miss Voss," he said. She sat. He asked her about Mr. Houghton. She told him about the letter and the draft response. He asked her about Baxter and Crane. She walked him through Clause 7. He read the draft letter she had prepared and returned it without comment. Then he asked her what the estate's annual revenue had been in 1812, the year before she had begun managing the accounts. £7,240, Your Grace. It was 8,110 in 1813. The increase came from the flour contract renegotiation, the consolidation of laundry suppliers, and a correction to the way the tenant rents were being recorded. There were 3 farms that had been listed at their old rates when the rates had been revised in 1811. He was quiet for a moment. "You found an error in the record." "Several small ones, yes. Over a full year, they amounted to about 400 annually in recovered margin." He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the ledger, then at the column of arrears, then briefly at her. "I will authorize the drainage repair today," he said, "and the temporary roof measure. Leave me the letters for Houghton and Baxter and Crane. I will have them sent under my name." Eleanor noted this without changing her expression. Under my name. Yes. She had written both letters entirely. She would not be attached to either of them once they left this room. She picked up her list and continued. The estate had a new steward engaged by the end of the week, a Mr. Oliver Marsh, who arrived from London with good references and a pleasant manner, and who, Eleanor understood immediately, would need at least 6 months to learn what she already knew about every tenant, every supplier, and every contested entry in the ledgers she was handing over to him. She did not resent Mr. Marsh. He was competent in a general way, and did not condescend to her, which was more than she had expected. But the morning after he arrived, she went back to her room behind the still room, and looked at the space the estate work had occupied in her days for 4 years, and understood that the space was now going to be officially empty. She was not going to step aside for anyone, but stepping aside had already been arranged without her. She was good enough at arithmetic to understand that too. Eleanor Voss had not come to Ashford Park by any planned route. She had come because, 6 years earlier, she had been employed as a governess in the household of a Mr. and Mrs. Carmichael in Shropshire, and Mrs. Carmichael's aunt, Lady Mercer, had visited for a summer, and concluded that Eleanor was wasted on the Carmichael children, and should come with her instead. Eleanor's father had been a schoolmaster in Worcestershire, a precise and learned man who had taught her Latin, basic accounting, and the specific intellectual habit of reading a document as a whole, before forming an opinion of any part of it. He had died when she was 19, of a fever that moved through the village in March of 1804, and had left behind a small house, a library that his creditors did not know to value, and an eldest sister-in-law who moved in within a fortnight and began reorganizing the household as her own. Eleanor had not fought it. She had taken her father's books, her father's 2 best letters of recommendation, and the habit of early rising, and she had gone to find work. The Carmichael household paid poorly, and the children were ordinary in their difficulties, no worse than children generally, and Eleanor had spent 3 years there doing what she was paid to do, and, in the hours around it, keeping herself alive in a way that had nothing to do with her employment. She read everything in the house's library. She taught herself the basic principles of estate accounting from a manual she found in the back of a cupboard that had belonged to Mrs. Carmichael's father. She learned to balance the household's kitchen accounts because the cook asked her to, and because the problem was interesting, and because it was something to do. She had not told anyone she was doing it. There had been one moment, in the second winter at the Carmichael house, when she could have stopped. The eldest daughter had fallen ill, and for 3 weeks Eleanor had slept 3 hours a night, and managed the sick room, and kept the household running, and the other children shielded from the severity of what they were watching, and at the end of it the daughter had recovered, and Mr. Carmichael had thanked her warmly, and then explained that he would have to reduce her quarterly payment for the following term, because the doctor's fees had been considerable. She had stood in his study, holding the reduced figure in her head, and understood quite clearly that a choice was available to her. She could become less. She could do less, expect less, be available for less, make herself into a smaller outline so that the room did not notice her well enough to diminish her further. She had not made that choice. She had gone back to her room, opened the kitchen accounts that were hers to balance, and found 6 shillings in waste that she eliminated before the end of the month. It was not defiance. It was the decision that she was not going to become less than she was. Not for the Carmichaels, not for Ashford Park, not for the social machinery that had arranged her life with such cheerful indifference to her quality. She brought everything she had, and she put it to work. Lady Mercer had seen this. That was the thing Eleanor held on to carefully, because she did not often have things to hold. The old woman had watched her for 3 weeks during that summer visit, and then one evening had said, without preamble, "You have a very precise mind, Miss Voss. Most people use their minds the way they use their shoes, wherever the pavement is smooth. You use yours differently." Eleanor had not known what to say. No one had said anything like this to her before. She had managed to say, "Thank you, my lady," which was insufficient, but was what she had. "Come with me," Lady Mercer had said. "I'm bored, and you're wasted, and those are 2 problems that appear to solve each other." She had gone. And for 2 years she had read and managed and been useful in ways that stretched farther and farther past the formal edges of a companion's role. Until Lady Mercer died, and the role ended, and Eleanor found herself at Ashford Park, with no position and no clear prospect, and the accounts and estate that made her pick up the pen almost before she had decided to. She had never, in any of this, been seen the way Lady Mercer had seen her. Not until now. She was not sure yet what to make of the way the Duke had looked at the hall. James Aldrich Cavendish, the 4th Duke of Ashford, had hired a private inquiry agent in the 3rd week of February, when the solicitor's office forwarded him the 2nd letter from Mr. Houghton, with a note suggesting that someone at the estate appeared to be managing the situation competently, and the Duke might wish to know who. The report had arrived on a Thursday. He had read it in the study of his London townhouse, which contained very little furniture, and no personal effects, except a framed watercolor that had belonged to his mother, and a piano that had not been opened since her death 9 years ago. The report was 12 pages. Most of it concerned the condition of the estate, the creditor disputes, the collapsed drainage, the roof. The last 3 pages concerned Miss Eleanor Voss. She was 28 years old. She had been employed as Lady Mercer's companion. She had no family of standing. Her father had been a schoolmaster. She had, according to the inquiry agent's information, renegotiated the flour contract in her 2nd month of managing the accounts, saving the estate an estimated £40 annually. She had identified a recording error in the tenant rent ledgers that had cost the estate £400 over 3 years. She had drafted letters to 2 creditors whose disputes she had correctly analyzed, in both cases without any legal instruction. She had done all of this without a title, without authorization, and on £12 a year. He had read that last detail twice. £12 a year. He thought about the estate's annual revenue of £8,000, which had been $7,240 before she sat down at the table. He thought about the difference between those 2 numbers, which was $870, and which was a larger margin than his previous steward had produced in any of the 4 years before his death. He set the report down. He had been in London for 14 months because London had seemed, in a formless way, to require him. There were meetings, there were investments, there were obligations to the dukedom that looked like reasons to be away. What there was not, at Ashford Park, was anyone to come back for. His mother had died 9 years ago. His father lived in the north and had made it clear on several occasions that the management of the Ashford estate was James's problem, and any failure of it would be evidence of a general inadequacy he had long suspected. His engagement to Lady Cecily Hartwell, arranged 6 years ago at his father's strong suggestion, had been terminated by mutual agreement 2 years after that. Lady Cecily having concluded with some justice that a man who spent more time with account ledgers than with people was not the kind of man who would make her happy. He was not, on reflection, the kind of man who made anyone happy. He sat with the inquiry agent's report in his hand. He thought about a woman who had found £870 in a ledger that no one had assigned her to read, and who had been living for 4 years on 12 of them. He had gone back to Ashford Park. That much he understood about himself. He did not act on feeling. He acted on information, once he was certain he had read it correctly. And the information in the report said, more clearly than the agent had intended, that Ashford Park was being held together by someone who was not going to be acknowledged for it, unless he acknowledged her. He went back. He saw the hall in proper order despite the rain. He saw the ledger organized exactly as it should have been. He saw the woman who had done all of this stand up from her chair with her spine straight and answer every question with the specific, unhurried accuracy of someone who had been ready for this conversation for months and had simply been waiting for someone to show up and have it. He sent Mr. Marsh to the North Tenant Farms on Thursday. He spent the morning in the estate office with the ledgers, working through the creditor accounts, and came twice to ask Eleanor questions that were nominally about the accounts, and were, she understood, also about whether she would continue to be as precise in his presence as she had been in his absence. She was exactly that precise, and she did not perform it. On Friday evening, he heard her from the corridor. The music room was at the end of the east wing, past the green baize door, and down a corridor that smelled of plaster and old wood. The piano had been his mother's, a Broadwood, kept tuned by the estate's habit even when no one played it. Eleanor had found the music room in her first month at Ashford Park, in the way one finds a quiet room in a house, by following the hallway until it stopped. She played badly enough that she never played when the household was active. But on Friday evenings, when the upper staff were at supper and the kitchen was winding down, the east wing was quiet. She was playing something she had found in the piano bench, a handwritten composition, 12 pages in a careful feminine hand, marked only at the top with the initials EMC. She had learned it over the course of 2 years without knowing whose it was. It was a serious piece, structured like a series of conversations, rather than a performance. Themes that returned and revised themselves, each repetition slightly altered, as though whoever had written it was not trying to resolve the music so much as understand it. She played it through from the beginning. She did not hear the Duke in the corridor. He stood outside the closed door for 20 minutes. When she finished, he remained where he was for another full minute, his hand resting on the wall, not moving. Then he walked back to the study. He sat down at the desk and opened the estate office file that contained the household history, the staff records, the family documents Lady Mercer had left behind. He looked for the initials EMC. He found them in 11 minutes. Elizabeth Margaret Cavendish, his mother, who had played the piano in the East Wing and written compositions in a careful hand, and died in 1805, when James was 25, and the grief of it had locked him out of that corridor ever since. Someone had been playing his mother's music. Someone had been playing it, alone, in a closed room, for 2 years, without knowing whose it was. He did not go back to the music room that evening. He went the following Friday and the Friday after that, and he stood in the corridor until she finished, and then walked back to the study, and it was not until the 3rd Friday that he understood that the fact of his standing there was the most personal thing he had done in 9 years. The opposition to Eleanor Voss had a shape and a schedule. Lady Cecily Hartwell arrived at Ashford Park in the 3rd week of October, brought by the elder Duke's campaign to have his son's disorganized romantic situation resolved. She came with her mother and a quantity of luggage that suggested a planned stay rather than a visit, and she was everything that the social architecture of 1813 required a duke's wife to be: beautiful, composed, from a family of unimpeachable standing, and entirely aware of her own value. She arrived in the entrance hall with the particular ease of someone who has been calculating room arrangements for years, and her eyes moved through it, the fresh lamps, the ordered hall table, the smooth floor, with an expression that Eleanor, watching from the corridor doorway with the afternoon's Post in her hands, recognized as the expression of a woman deciding what would need to be changed. Eleanor pressed one hand briefly against the doorframe, quietly, where no one could see, and then went back to the estate office. She had 7 items on the afternoon list. Lady Cecily was not cruel. She was, in some ways, more difficult than cruelty would have been, because she was simply indifferent in the way that people are indifferent to furniture. She greeted Eleanor twice in the first week. Once when Eleanor brought the household schedule to Mrs. Hartwell's attention, regarding the dinner arrangements, and once when Eleanor was in the drawing room, reviewing the silver inventory, and Lady Cecily walked through with 3 other ladies and said, "Oh, who is that?" to her mother, who said, quietly enough that Eleanor was clearly expected not to hear, "The housekeeper," or something of that sort, and Lady Cecily had moved on without requiring an answer. Eleanor was not going to be destabilized by furniture, because she was not furniture. She returned to the silver inventory. The elder Duke of Ashford arrived at the end of October. His name was William Henry Cavendish, and he was 61 years old, and he had the look of a man who had decided at 35 that his judgments were final, and had not revisited that decision since. He was not unkind. He was simply constructed in the way that certain men are constructed, on the premise that the maintenance of appropriate social order was not a preference but a moral obligation, and anyone who disrupted it was disrupting something with the weight of structure behind it. He met Eleanor on a Tuesday morning in the entrance hall, noticed her by the hall table, and asked Mr. Crewe who she was. Mr. Crewe said, "Miss Voss, Your Grace. She has been managing the estate accounts in Mr. Fenn's absence." The elder Duke looked at Eleanor with the specific attention of a man reviewing a disruption. "Has she?" he said. He did not say it to Eleanor. He said it to Mr. Crewe, who was standing 3 feet to Eleanor's left. Eleanor was holding the morning's post. The elder Duke walked past her toward the study. Eleanor understood the politics precisely. She had been managing estates long enough to recognize an argument made by spatial arrangement. She picked up her list and continued. The estate office had become, in the 5 weeks since the Duke's return, a place Eleanor thought of in the way she thought about the arrangement of the morning's work. Dependable, known, requiring her attention in specific ways. The Duke was there most mornings. He read the accounts and asked questions, and on 3 occasions had asked her to stay while he wrote his responses to the London investment correspondents, not to assist with the writing but because, Eleanor suspected, without allowing herself to be certain, the answers came more clearly when there was someone in the room who had already read the problem. On a Wednesday in the last week of October, the morning after his father arrived, he was in the office when Eleanor brought in the ledger of the Northern Tenant Farms, which Mr. Marsh had been reviewing, but had left with 3 unresolved questions that Eleanor had resolved herself and annotated in the margins. The Duke read the annotations. He read them carefully. This assessment of the Birch Farms drainage as a systemic issue rather than an isolated repair, he said. Marsh didn't write this. No, Your Grace. You did. The drainage channel that collapsed in August is the 3rd in that corner of the estate in 8 years. The pattern suggests the ground subsidence is affecting the whole northeast quarter. If we repair in isolation, we'll spend £12 now and £12 again in 2 years. If we address the quarter as a whole, it will cost £62 once and save the recurring expense. He looked at the annotated page for a moment without speaking. Have you given this to Marsh? I have outlined the pattern for him. The recommendation is his to make, Your Grace. He set the ledger down. He turned in his chair and looked at her, not with the measuring attention of the first morning, but with something slightly different. The attention of a man who is looking at something he has already decided is extraordinary, and is now locating the precise detail that proves it. The plan I presented to my father this morning, he said. The investment sequencing for the northern properties. Eleanor waited. It was based on your arrears column, the ordering, the cost projections, the argument for addressing the drainage quarter systemically, rather than by incident. You assembled it very clearly, she said. I thought the presentation would carry well. A housekeeper does not advise a duke, he said. His tone was not the elder duke's tone. There was something dry in it. Testing. No, Your Grace, she said. She does not. She keeps the ledger correctly, and makes the annotations legible, and trusts that the Duke is in a position to read them. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, What would you have done about the Baxter and Crane contract if they had not produced a record of the verbal exchange? I would have asked them to agree to a joint inspection of their warehouse records. If they refused, I would have noted the refusal in writing and filed it with the estate's solicitor. The refusal itself is evidence of the kind a court finds significant. You've read contract law. Enough to be practical, Your Grace. He stood up. He took his coat from the back of the chair. He had removed it an hour ago without formality, in the way a man who has been inside a house long enough stops performing his presence in it, and walked to the window. The October rain had been replaced by something colder, a hard, clear light that showed the north fields in precise detail. My father will ask me to establish a formal position for you, he said, not turning from the window. Something appropriate to what you've actually been doing. A senior housekeeper's title, perhaps, or an estate manager's assistant. Eleanor said nothing. He will then point out that the establishment of such a position for a woman of your background in a ducal household will invite commentary, that it sets a disruption, his word, in something structural. He would not be incorrect about the commentary, Eleanor said. No. He turned then. He would be incorrect about whether that is a reason. She held this sentence carefully. She did not allow herself to treat it as something other than it was. Is there something specific you need from me this morning, Your Grace? I need you to tell me what you think about the East Tenant Farms. Marsh thinks the rents are correctly assessed. You didn't say anything when I reviewed his report. I thought his analysis was reasonable, Eleanor said, but I would look at the Eastern Farms' output per acre over the last 5 years before confirming the rent assessment. There is a pattern in the Northwest fields that suggests the East might be underperforming on similar land, which would mean the rents are either too high for the actual yield or the yield is being suppressed by a management issue. You would look at 5 years of output records. I already have them, she said. I can have an analysis ready tomorrow. He said, have it ready today. She had it ready by 3 in the afternoon. The Cavendish dinner on the last Friday of October was the largest social gathering the estate had held since the Duke's return. 14 guests, the county families, the Hartwells, the elder Duke and his secretary. Eleanor organized it with Mr. Crewe and spent the day confirming arrangements without attending. She was not a guest. She was the person who ensured the centerpiece flowers were replaced when the first delivery was found to have wilted overnight, and who identified that the seating arrangement had placed 2 families with a decade-long boundary dispute directly opposite each other and quietly redesigned 2/3 of the table before noon. Lady Cecily found her at the seating chart at 1:30. You've moved the Penroses, she said. There was a placement issue, Eleanor said. Nothing that will affect the evening. I arranged that table yesterday. The Penrose and Alderton families have a property dispute over the Marsh Common boundary. They've been in correspondence with the county court for 11 years. Across a dining table of 14, that conversation happens whether anyone wants it to or not. Lady Cecily looked at the revised arrangement. She looked at it for several seconds, which was long enough that Eleanor recognized it as something other than dismissal. Which families have you seated them with instead? She asked. Eleanor told her. The Clarks will draw out Mr. Penrose on the subject of his orchards, Lady Cecily said. He talks about those orchards at unsuitable length. Yes, Eleanor said. But Mr. Alderton is on the other side of the table, interested in the Pemberton estate's drainage work, and Lord Pemberton has more to say about drainage than any man I have ever met. Lady Cecily stood very still for one moment, then she turned and walked toward the drawing room. She did not say anything more, but she had stopped. The elder Duke came to the estate office the following morning. Eleanor was alone when he arrived. She stood, as was correct. He looked at the ledgers on the desk. He looked at the annotated analysis of the East Tenant Farms, which the Duke had left open on the desk after reading it the previous afternoon. You compiled this, he said. Yes, Your Grace. My son intends to use it as the basis for the Eastern rent assessment. I believe so. He picked up the top page. He read it. His expression did not change. He set it down. You understand, he said, that the position you currently occupy is not a position. I understand that precisely, Your Grace. And you understand that what my son is, considering, with respect to your situation here, would be a significant departure from what is done. I understand that as well, He looked at her for a long moment. He was not unkind. He was reading something, the way he read a document, searching for the flaw in the structure that would allow him to dismiss the whole. "You have managed this estate," he said finally, "for nearly 5 years. 4 years and 7 months. He nodded once. A single, deliberate nod. "The plan he presented to the investment group in September," he said. "The northern property sequencing." Eleanor waited. "That was yours." She did not confirm or deny it. She held his gaze. He set the page down. He turned toward the door, and then, with his hand on the frame, he said, without warmth and without contempt, "My wife kept the accounts at our first house in Yorkshire. Before we had a steward. I did not know she had done it until the year after." He paused. "I thought the accounts had managed themselves." He left. Eleanor stood at the desk for a moment after he had gone. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the desk, not in distress, simply an acknowledgement of something significant having passed through the room. Then she picked up her pen and continued. "The estate solicitor, a Mr. Edward Fairweather, arrived in the second week of November. He was 70, precise, and had served the Cavendish family for 36 years. He had reviewed the 2 letters to Houghton and Baxter and Crane, when the Duke forwarded them from London, had written in his own response to the Duke that whoever had drafted them had read Clause 7 correctly, and had constructed an argument that would satisfy any commercial court in England, and had spent 6 weeks wondering who the author was." He found Eleanor in the estate office reviewing the year-end accounts. He sat down across from her, with the manner of a man who has decided to be direct. "You wrote the Baxter letter," he said. "I drafted it," Eleanor said. "The Duke sent it under his name." "Yes, he mentioned that." Mr. Fairweather looked at the ledger she had open. "May I?" She turned it toward him. He read for several minutes. "You've been doing this for nearly 5 years," he said. "On £12 a year," Eleanor said. "I'm aware." He looked at her over his spectacles. "I have worked for this family for 36 years, Miss Voss. I have reviewed the accounts of 4 stewards, 2 estate managers, and 1 remarkably competent land agent, who left us in 1808 for a better arrangement in Lincolnshire. I have not reviewed work of this quality since he left." He paused. "I wanted to say so, directly, since I understand it has not been said." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. He was watching her with the particular steadiness of a man who means exactly what he says, and is waiting to see if she will receive it. "Thank you," she said, which was still insufficient, but which was what she had. "The Duke is going to ask you something formally in the next few days," Mr. Fairweather said. "I thought you might want some warning, so you would have time to consider your answer before giving it. Your answers are better when they are considered. You've only just met me, Mr. Fairweather." "I've read 4 years and 7 months of your ledgers," he said. "I know how you think." The kitchen maid, a girl named Nell Barton who was 20, and had the practical sensibility of someone 10 years older, had appointed herself as Eleanor's informal intelligence service from the Duke's first week at the estate. She delivered information the way she delivered morning tea, without ceremony and at exactly the right temperature. "Lady Cecily's mother has been in the blue sitting room with the elder Duke for an hour," Nell told Eleanor on a Thursday afternoon, "and Lady Cecily herself has been in the front drawing room, looking at nothing since luncheon." "Thank you, Nell," Eleanor said, without looking up from the accounts. "She doesn't look angry exactly," Nell said. "She looks like she's working something out." Eleanor thought about this. "Lady Cecily is not a foolish woman," she said. "She has simply been told a particular version of events for a long time." Nell considered this. Then she said, "She moved the centerpiece this morning. Put it back where you had it for the dinner, the one you changed back after she'd moved it." Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at nothing for a moment, thinking. "Is that so?" she said. Then she picked up her pen and continued. The moment of public reckoning did not arrive in a ballroom. It arrived in the estate's great hall on a Thursday, in the second week of November, when the Duke assembled the investment group that held the financing agreements on 3 of Ashford Park's northern properties. There were 9 men in the room: the Duke, his father, Mr. Fairweather, 3 investors from the London group, and 2 local men whose families had held mortgage interests in the northern properties since 1808. The question before them was the renegotiation of the financing terms. The existing agreements were expensive by the standards of 1813, carrying interest rates that had been set in the uncertain climate of 1808, and the Duke intended to argue for revised terms on the basis that the estate's improved financial position merited reconsideration. Eleanor had prepared the case. She had been asked by the Duke 3 days earlier to prepare it, not to present it, to prepare it. She had assembled the 5-year account summaries, the creditor resolution records, the East Tenant Farm analysis, the drainage assessment, and a single-page document that showed, in comparative figures, what the Ashford estate had paid in interest over 5 years at the 1808 rate against what the equivalent period would cost at the current market rate. The difference was £3,040. She had handed the prepared documents to the Duke the previous evening. He had read through them, turned the last page, and said, "Come tomorrow." She had stood in his office in the evening light and said, "Your Grace?" "To the meeting," he said. "Come tomorrow. Bring your ledger." She had gone back to her room and sat for several minutes with her hands in her lap. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, completely, without hurrying, and when she had finished thinking, she went to her desk and checked the figures once more, not because she doubted them, but because precision was the thing she brought to every room, and she was not going to stop bringing it now. She arrived at the Great Hall Thursday morning at 9 with the ledger, the annotated documents, and no particular expression. The 9 men were already seated. Mr. Fairweather caught her eye and indicated the chair at the end of the table with a slight movement of his head. The elder Duke saw her enter and was still. The London investors looked at each other briefly. The Duke, at the head of the table, said, "Miss Voss has been managing this estate's accounts for 4 years and 7 months. She will present the financial record." There was a silence that lasted approximately 8 seconds. One of the London investors, a Mr. Thorne, said, "I was under the impression we were reviewing the steward's accounts." "The steward has been here for 6 weeks," the Duke said. "The accounts were prepared by Miss Voss. If you have questions about the figures, she is the person to ask." Mr. Thorne looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the ledger. She set it open to the first summary page. "In 1812, she said, the estate's annual revenue was £7,240. In 1813, it was 8,110. In 1814, based on the year-to-date figures, it will be approximately 8,460. She turned a page. The increase reflects 3 adjustments: a renegotiation of the flour contract, a consolidation of laundry suppliers, and a correction to the tenant rent records that identified a recording error affecting 3 farms. Copies of each adjustment are in the documents before you. She did not argue. She did not plead. She presented. She walked through each document in sequence. The creditor resolutions. Houghton settled in full. Baxter and Crane resolved by reference to the contract clause. Total creditor debt reduced from £940 to £210. The drainage assessment, showing the cost of systemic repair against the projected cost of continued incident repair. The savings over 5 years amounting to just under £300. The East Tenant Farm analysis, showing the underperformance pattern and the revised assessment's projected contribution to the estate's revenue. Then she set the final document in front of each man. This page shows the interest paid on the 3 northern financing agreements over the period 1808 to 1814, at the contracted rate, and the equivalent figure at the current market rate. The difference is £3,040, what the estate has paid in excess of current market terms over 6 years. The estate's improved financial position, as documented in the preceding pages, represents an argument for renegotiation that Mr. Fairweather will articulate in legal terms. She closed the ledger. The room did not respond immediately. There was a suspended moment, the kind that arrives when the people in a room are doing the work of recalibrating something they believed was a different shape than it turns out to be. Mr. Thorne was looking at the final comparison document. He turned to the page behind it. He turned to the page behind it. "These tenant farm figures," he said. "Are they the steward's projections or yours?" "Mine," Eleanor said. He read for another moment. The methodology, he said, is based on output per acre comparison across analogous soil types in the same county, using the agricultural survey records from 1810. I can show you the source documents. He looked at her. He was not recalibrated, exactly. He was the expression of a man who had arrived with a structure in his mind. A structure in which this meeting had a particular shape and the people in it occupied particular roles, and who was in the process of discovering that the structure did not match the facts as presented. The documents are well organized, he said finally. Thank you, Eleanor said. It was the elder Duke of Ashford who spoke next. He said, from his chair at the Duke's right, I should like the record to show that the estate accounts presented today were prepared by Miss Voss, who has managed this estate's finances since January of this year, and, in effect, since the death of the previous steward. Everyone in the room looked at him, including the Duke. The elder Duke did not look at Eleanor. He looked at the table in front of him, but the sentence had been said, in front of 9 witnesses, in the room where it needed to be said. Eleanor kept her expression still. She held the ledger in her hands and was quiet. The financing terms were renegotiated, not to everything Eleanor had recommended, but to a rate that represented a saving of £180 annually on the 3 northern agreements, with a review provision in 18 months. So Mr. Fairweather said afterward that it was the strongest outcome the evidence could have produced, and that the comparison document had done the work of 3 arguments. The Duke remained in the great hall after the investors left. His father had gone. Mr. Fairweather was gathering his papers. Eleanor was closing the ledger. He stood at the head of the table and said, to the room, though he was looking at her, the plan I praised to my father in October was hers. The letter to the Baxter merchants was hers. The analysis that produced this morning's outcome was hers. Mr. Fairweather said, looking at his papers. Yes. The Duke came around the table. He took Eleanor's hand, her bare hand, she was not wearing gloves, she never wore gloves when she was working, and held it for a moment, and then bent and kissed it, not as a social gesture, as the acknowledgement of something that had been true for a long time and required a witness audience to be spoken aloud. Mr. Fairweather was a witness audience. He was reading his papers with great attention. Miss Voss, the Duke said, I would like to speak with you privately, if you are not otherwise engaged this afternoon. Eleanor looked at him. The measuring attention she had first seen in the entrance hall had shifted into something that had a different quality. Certain, considered, and a little exposed, the way a structure looks when its exterior has been removed and the actual framework is visible. I have 3 items on my afternoon list, Your Grace, she said. After those, he said. She thought about it. Yes, she said. The private conversation took place in the estate office at 4 in the afternoon, after Eleanor had completed her 3 afternoon items and found the Duke in the estate office with no ledger open in front of him, which was unusual. He was standing at the window. I intend to ask you something, he said when she came in, that you are not obligated to answer in any particular way, and I want to be exact about what I am asking and why, so there is no misreading. Eleanor stood. She held the afternoon ledger against her chest. He turned from the window. He looked at her for a moment with the steady attention she had come to understand was what it looked like when he had decided something. I have been back at this estate for 6 weeks, he said. In that time I have come to understand that this house has been functioning because of the specific quality of your mind and your work. I have also come to understand something more particular, which is that when I stand in the corridor outside the music room on Friday evenings, I am not standing there because of the estate accounts. Eleanor was very still. My mother's composition, she said. Yes. He did not look away. You learned it without knowing whose it was. I found the manuscript in the piano bench 2 years ago. I didn't know. I know you didn't. He paused. You played it the way she intended it to be played. I had not heard it played correctly since she died. Eleanor pressed her hand once, briefly, against the cover of the ledger. I'm sorry, she said. About your mother. She would have liked you, he said. She kept her own accounts. No one knew until after. He came away from the window. He stood in front of her, not close, a measured distance. I am asking you to marry me, Miss Voss. Not because the position requires a mistress, or because my father has opinions about the Hartwell arrangement, or because your management of this estate has made it reasonable. Those things are all true, but they are not the reason. He reached into his coat and drew out a single folded page. He placed it on the desk between them. Eleanor looked at it. It was the annotated drainage analysis she had written 3 weeks ago, the one identifying the systemic subsidence in the northeast quarter. Her handwriting, her annotations. Across the top of it, in his hand, he had written 3 words. I read this. Because, he said, you have been doing the work of someone who matters in this house for years, and no one has said so, and I have had the specific experience of standing in a corridor every Friday evening for 3 weeks, knowing that the person inside that room was someone I could not afford not to know. Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most precise person I have ever encountered, and that has turned out to be the specific thing I did not know I needed. The room was quiet. The light was the thin, clear light of November at 4 o'clock. Eleanor held the ledger. She thought about it completely, the way she thought about a clause, a figure, a document. She thought about what it would cost. She thought about the elder Duke's sentence in the Great Hall that morning, and about Mr. Fairweather reading his papers with great attention, and about Nell Barton and the centerpiece moved back to where Eleanor had placed it. She thought about standing outside her father's library at 19 with her father's books under her arm, and the decision she had made, that she was not going to become less than she was. I will need a formal position, she said, a title that reflects what I have been doing, with a salary attached, not because I am negotiating, but because the arrangement must be accurate from the beginning, or it will develop inaccuracies later. He said, yes. And the East Tenant Farms will need the full 5-year output analysis completed before the spring assessment. Mr. Marsh is competent, but he will need another 6 months before he can do it independently. I know. And your cravat, she said, has been crooked since this morning. It has been crooked for at least 7 hours. He looked at her. What? You could have mentioned it earlier, he said. You seem to have things on your mind, she said. She set the ledger on the desk, reached up, and straightened it. Her hands were steady. Her hands were always steady. Yes, she said, I will marry you. He did not say anything immediately. He simply stayed where he was, with the corrected cravat and the annotated drainage analysis on the desk, and the afternoon light on the estate he had come back to, and would not leave again. Then he said, quietly, Thank you, Miss Voss. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor, he said. They married in December, at the estate church, in a ceremony attended by the household staff, Mr. Fairweather, and, to Eleanor's private surprise, the elder Duke of Ashford, who sat in the front pew without expression, and when it was finished, shook his son's hand, and said to Eleanor, with the same tone he had used in the estate office, neither warm nor unkind, the drainage analysis was correct. We should have addressed that quarter years ago. It was not an apology. It was the acknowledgement of evidence, offered without warmth, by a man of absolute precision who had finally read the document correctly. Eleanor received it for what it was. Lady Cecily Hartwell sent a note in January, a brief and correct message of congratulation. It was civil, measured, and contained a single line at the end that Eleanor read twice. The dinner seating you arranged in October was the best I have attended in 3 years. She did not attend the wedding. She was, by February, engaged to a baronet in Somerset who had a fine library and, Eleanor had heard, a genuine enthusiasm for his wife's opinions. Eleanor hoped it would serve her well. The professional legacy arrived in the form Eleanor had half expected. In the spring of 1815, Eleanor completed the Eastern Tenant Farm analysis, the full 5-year assessment, the output per acre comparison, the revised assessment that produced an additional £230 in estate revenue, while reducing the rent burden on 2 farms that had been overcharged relative to yield. Mr. Marsh, who had by then grown into his role with enough competence to know what he was looking at, asked if he could share the methodology with his counterpart at the neighboring Thornton estate, who was wrestling with a similar problem. Eleanor said yes. The methodology spread to 4 estates in the county over 2 years. In 1817, Mr. Fairweather asked Eleanor to write it up formally, as a document suitable for the guidance of estate managers generally. She did, in clear and measured prose, without flourish, in the same tone she had used to draft the letter to Baxter and Crane. It ran to 31 pages, and was printed by a London publisher of agricultural and estate management texts. It did not carry her name, by the publisher's preference, and over Mr. Fairweather's objection. It carried, on the dedication page, 3 words: to EMC. Eleanor had written that page herself. Their daughter was born in November of 1815. They named her Charlotte Elizabeth Cavendish, Charlotte for the friend Eleanor had made at Mr. Fairweather's Christmas gathering that first winter. A brisk, direct woman named Charlotte Pierce, who had told Eleanor within 20 minutes of meeting her that she had the eyes of someone who had been keeping count of things for a long time, and Elizabeth for the woman whose composition Eleanor had learned in a closed room without knowing whose it was. Charlotte was born with her father's dark hair and her mother's tendency to look at a room as though she was calculating something about it. By the time she was 4, she had developed the habit of following Eleanor through the estate office, on quiet mornings, and watching her work without speaking, which Eleanor allowed, and which the Duke, from the doorway, watched with an expression that had no particular name, but which was warm and specific, and entirely his. The estate at Ashford Park was not the same house it had been in January of 1814. The drainage of the northeast quarter had been addressed in the spring of 1815, the east wing roof repaired in full, the creditor accounts closed, and the arrears column, the one Eleanor had kept through the long invisible years, reduced to 0 by the summer of 1816. On an evening in January of 1818, Eleanor was at the desk in the estate office, working by lamplight on the year-end accounts, when she heard the door open. She did not look up. She knew the sound of that particular footstep. He came to stand behind her. He read the page she was working on over her shoulder for a moment, in the easy and particular way of 2 people who have stopped performing their presents for each other. "The Northfield rents," she said. "Birch has finally improved his output. His yield is up 14%. I see that. We'll need to revisit the drainage maintenance schedule for next spring. I'll have a note on it by the end of the week. Eleanor." She set down her pen. She turned in her chair and looked at him. He was standing in the lamplight with Charlotte asleep on his shoulder. She had escaped the nursemaid again, as she did at this hour with impressive regularity. One small hand curled against his coat, her dark hair against his collar. He was watching Eleanor with the specific attention she had first seen in the entrance hall 4 years ago, which had turned out not to be the measuring attention of a man identifying something he did not understand, but the attention of a man identifying something he recognized for the first time and intended to keep. "Come to bed," he said. Eleanor looked at the ledger. She looked at him. She looked at Charlotte, who had one small fist pressed against the fabric of his coat, as though she was holding on to something essential. She closed the ledger and rose, and the lamp was the last thing extinguished in the room, and the house settled around them in the January dark, solid and warm and accounted for.